Hi everybody, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'd like to acknowledge that we're on unceded Darug country today and acknowledge Darug elders past and present. It took me a bit of time. I was so pleased to get the invitation to speak, but it took me a bit of time to work out what on earth I was going to contribute to the discussion for a few reasons. And I took a punt that being fairly late in the day, the question of what is theory would already have been very richly covered by earlier panels, which thankfully it has been. And so I wonder, I'm still not sure how much I can add to the question of what is theory, except perhaps to venture that I'm less confident of knowing the answer of what is or is not theory than I was 20 years ago when I was doing my own PhD. But what I'll do is focus really on the sort of keywords of this panel around narrative and text and genre, and launch my reflections from the writing process that I recently completed that Sophie just mentioned in the introduction. And I think the book is actually officially out next month, but I'm not sure when I'll actually see a copy of it. You can see here a copy of the cover, and as Sophie mentioned, the idea is that we looked across these 4 different cities and worked collaboratively to understand what consumption and consumer practices look like for people who were previously described as the urban poor in these growing economies of middle-income nations. Effectively, we think they are still poor, but poverty now is just surrounded by a proliferation of material goods in a way that it wasn't for many people in the global south 30 or 40 years ago. I'm not going to go into the actual argument of the book more than I did just then, but I thought I would talk instead about the process of writing in collaboration and share some of the choices and compromises that we made along the way. You'll notice there's quite a few of us, the authors, if you can't see, if you're up the back. So there's 5 authors, as well as me. There's Rosana Pinero Machado, Ting Ting Lu, Serena Saloma, and Atsiri Molina. So 5 of us in total. And so I'll sort of try and touch a little bit on how we called upon narrative or narratives to manage in our writing what was a very unwieldy and sprawling but rich and tremendously rewarding writing adventure. How did we navigate telling the stories of participants in our work, and how could we reconcile and represent the ways that our work transformed over time and changed from site to site? We had to make decisions, of course, about including or excluding narratives, including those that related to our own relationships to these fields and their histories and theories. And the fact that we were writing collaboratively created a real proliferation of possible approaches that had to be wrangled into some semblance of order. I mean, if only to complete a text, we had to make decisions about how to order it all and sort of try to wrangle it. But we didn't want to impose a dishonest facade of total consistency across the different places and voices that contributed to the text. I'll just mention just talk about the images. They're not really in order. It's really a series of images that are part of our book, but we have more of them as well. We commissioned a series of visual essays from photojournalists or photographers as a part of our project. And those people looked at some of our draft data and responded through these photographs that I'll share with you today. I think the photos offer another mode of narrative to understand our collaboration, and when they're brought together, the photographs from different places they offer another conversation between the sites of our work. And so, I mean, that would really be a whole other discussion. They're really just here for you to enjoy looking at them and thinking about them as I talk. I'll try to remember to keep moving through them as we go. Okay, so as I mentioned, there were 5 authors, and we were all working together on this research project, but it did begin as a conversation between 2 of us, Rosanna and me, about 11 years ago. And then it expanded to become 4 of us by the time the grant officially began. And then a couple of years after that, we added a 5th. And as mentioned, there are these 4 cities that we cover in the writing: Guangzhou in China, Metro Manila in the Philippines, Mexico City in Mexico, and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So this project really had its precursor, the kind of theorising and the collaborating obviously had its precursor in years of conversation and research-based friendships across these multiple continents. Our trajectories traversed Europe, where 4 of us trained and 1 of us worked. And I don't want to invisibilise the kind of European origins of a lot of the work that happened here. It is what it is. But also Asia, where 2 of us lived and worked. The Americas, where 2 of us lived and worked. And Australia, where 1 of us trained and 1 of us worked. Now 2 of us actually work. All women. We were developing our careers in anthropology, sociology, global studies, media and cultural studies, various adjacent conversations. But on this project, I felt that we had earned the space to set our own terms in establishing our collaborative work practices. In some ways, the design of our research was really quite straightforward. Basically, we did 120 interviews with consumers across these 4 cities, so 30 in each place. We asked them about their everyday consumption practices and their plans for the future. We didn't undertake traditionally conceived ethnographic fieldwork in its purest sense. I don't think we can describe this as the kind of fieldwork that my own training saw as the gold standard of anthropology. But I do still think, in my opinion, that we generated ethnographic writing. The fieldwork was led in each city by someone who lived or worked there. But our research approach in each site was really informed by how we were talking and thinking across all 4 cities in focus. The interviews happened in 5 languages, but they were all transcribed and translated into English for shared use, because English was the only language that all of us spoke, although each of us spoke a minimum of 2 and more often 3 of the languages in the pool of study. So we had a pretty chunky and multilingual set of data in our interviews, which honestly was quite overwhelming. But then in the process of book writing, we managed to make it even more complicated. Our interest had been in thinking through our interviews in conversation with one another, and so this is ultimately reflected in the book's structure, where we don't carve up each city for separate analysis, but rather we try to trace themes across multiple sites formed by these conversations across investigators from our diverse perspectives, including, by the way, I must say, our teams of research assistants who were very much interlocutors in the formation of the ideas in our debriefs and discussions across the sites of what we were finding. So the 5 of us wrote the book all together, with some people taking leads on certain sections, but no chapter being anyone's sole responsibility. Some of the chapters focus on themes, like family or aspiration. Others focus on a category of material culture, like clothing or hardware supplies. Have a whole chapter on bagged cement, which is one of the later features. And so although some sites feature as a lead place for a topic, there are always inputs from other cities as well. And this reflected the dialogic development of the ideas that had taken place, often online. I mean, I won't go into what the COVID pandemic did to our methods and our practice of dialogical development. But it was in the learning from the participants from other cities, so not just learning from each other's experiences, but then learning from what participants were saying in other cities, that we were reflecting on the work in the places with which we were most familiar. For example, we decided to write a chapter about families. So Serena and I, who had been immersed in the Metro Manila site, found that no one could talk just about their own consumption practices. Every Filipino framed their preferences and patterns around the needs and desires of the family. Now, for anyone familiar with the Philippines, this is not at all surprising. In our chapter, we turn to these well-established theories of familism as a driving force in Philippine societies. It could very clearly be a standalone chapter about how everything in the Philippines is driven by familism. But of course, families and even familism was found in other field sites too. And so by starting in Metro Manila, where our knowledge of theories and our Filipino participants' own focus on familism was especially clear, it turned our attention to the way that people talked about family in the other cities in a fairly enriching way. So in terms of how we would frame narratives to write these chapters, this is just one of many examples I could have picked. But we turn to the familiar ethnographic technique of starting with a portrait or a vignette of one of our participants. In this case, it was Elena, who we invoked in our discussion from Metro Manila about families. And since this was the first time she appeared in the book, in this chapter we had to introduce her. So I'll just share a few words about a few sentences of quote from the book. So this is from the chapter on families. The perspective shared by Elena, a 32-year-old woman with a husband and small child, illustrates how strongly familism can shape a logic of consumption. Elena lives in an informal neighbourhood of Metro Manila, where she runs a small variety store, known as a sari-sari store, out of her home to supplement the salary of her husband, who works in a supermarket. Elena pays careful attention to every peso she spends. As one of the lower earners in our research, she reflected, "We are just simple. We really have no luxuries. We don't get to buy nice things." The birth of her son had clearly made Elena reassess her priorities in shopping and spending to ensure that she was taking care of her family, end quote. So I just think this is quite a representative way of how we handled the stories of informants as a way to start an idea or a discussion. It's then followed by a lengthy quote from Elena's own interview, which is then followed by a short paragraph of more of our interpretation. Elena's self-presented narrative is itself, of course, a reproduction of a particular genre of testimonies. I mean, explaining her poverty and her humility and her hard-workingness. But this narrative that she presented was a necessary anchor for our writing to demonstrate this prevalence of familism. Then, in the next section of the chapter, we present this very quick series of examples from other sites that include Meng Lin, a 22-year-old hotel receptionist in Guangzhou, the youngest of 3 children and the only daughter. Antonio, a 23-year-old journalist and student in Mexico City, who financially supports his sister's education. Yolanda, a homemaker of 41 in Mexico City, who cares for her 2 children. Rodrigo, a 34-year-old philosophy and physical education student in Brazil, who lived with his parents well into adulthood. And Omar, a dance student in Mexico City, who rejoiced in the assistance he received from his girlfriend's father when undertaking home renovations. You can see how these stories start to it's almost like you open this box and all this stuff starts to pour out. But these people and their stories, they're only brought very briefly into view as illustrations of our argument. They only hint at how these imaginary other chapters could be written about familism in China or Mexico or Brazil. We had to put a cap on how far outwards our explorations would sprawl, so the chapter tries to stick to the Philippines for most of what follows. And Elena pops up here and there in other chapters, but she's only ever an entry point into some kind of interpretation that our collective of authors has patched together. Now, bearing in mind that we were 3 anthropologists and 2 sociologists, just how much or how little we wanted to feature the stories of individual participants was one of the expressions of disciplinary difference that most often appeared in our drafts. I was one of the people who wanted more stories most often. And it is reasonable to ask whether the interviews, because these interviews were one-off conversations, they were not extended fieldwork engagements, it is reasonable to ask whether they were too thin to warrant the kind of extended portrait writing that may be better reserved for research participants who have been in relations with the researcher for many years. I think Nikita had a beautiful example of this earlier. Some of us worried that the research design had left us insufficiently ethnographic. My colleague Rosanna Pinero Machado, one of the project leaders, has advanced the argument elsewhere that ethnography is not merely realised through the process of open-ended interviews or through the practices of participant observation. For Rosanna, it's relationships with people and communities in the field that make research ethnographic. And I think I agree. But in this project working all together, we could not sustain relationships with all 120 of our participants in all of our fields in that way. I mean, for one thing, frankly, it's a question of budget. We don't have a big enough budget to sustain that scale of work. Others, including Rosanna, have been able to on other projects, which is amazing. But for another thing, we had to stagger our research out over several years. We were managing, all of us, several different responsibilities. And so we deliberately traded a depth of relationship for a breadth of stories from more people at just one moment in their lives. But a bigger challenge than the disciplinary differences was that we came from different regional traditions or had different areas of regional focus. And we were very used to our comfort zones of expertise in specific cities or countries. While we felt very comfortable commenting on each other's contributions, it was challenging to make the leap into writing chapters based on interviews that had come from places that were not our sites. Who am I to write about the wholesale markets of Shaheding in Guangzhou, having only visited once? How can Ting Ting, who has never been to Brazil, write about the fashion choices of 28-year-old Yara, who avoids fast fashion and seeks out local markets in the neighbourhoods of Rio de Janeiro? Why should sociological theories of familism in the Philippines be extended to explain the practices of our participants in Mexico? We tried to mitigate these worries by checking and cross-checking and running our ideas and drafts past the authors who knew these sites well, explaining specific cultural references and correcting misunderstandings of transcripts. But the worry remained, even within a team so comfortable with the interdisciplinary application of theory, the worry remained that we had not been sufficiently connected or immersed to be responsible stewards of our participants' narratives. And I think this is really a concern about authority. You know, this has been discussed or touched on a couple of times today. We were unsettling our own expectations about what constitutes the authority to theorise or even to interpret, and about whom. How am I going for time? Have I still got... Yeah. Sorry?
Wrap up.
Yeah, okay. So when I was thinking about all of this, I briefly revisited an early piece of work by Edward Brunner from about 1986 on ethnography as narratives. Kind of one of the first pieces, I think, around that were simultaneous with the whole writing culture movement that was mentioned earlier. Because I remembered him talking about ethnography as narrative specifically. And he finds that narrative is ultimately what guides ethnographic analysis. The data of ethnography, or reports of practices or collections of objects, obviously place guardrails on how a researcher can make an argument. But it's in the narratives, Brunner says, that are generated by the researcher that the argument is constructed, and that these narratives are generated through specific historical circumstances. Brunner explores what he describes as 3 tellings of fieldwork, although he actually lists 4, which is really confusing, but anyway. So first of all, the editor tells, the anthropologist tells the fieldwork participants why they are there, and then this commences a dialogue with the participants. The second telling is when the anthropologist writes these notes of preliminary interpretation. And the third telling is the kind of presentation of this work in full flight to colleagues and peers. And then a fourth telling is the circulation of that work to be incorporated into other people's tellings of other work. I would say also, obviously, in recent decades, we've become increasingly focused on expecting tellings back to the participants. Anyway, Brunner describes anthropologists and participants or informants as co-authors of ethnographies by dialogically constructing shared narratives. If we took this literally in the case of my book, we would have 135 authors, so which is a bit of a stressful thought. And I'm not sure that our participants have been given the agency to really be described as co-authors. We certainly make use of their stories, and I hope we do so respectfully, but I think a co-authorship is pretending that they had more control over that material than they did. But in our book writing, where the layers of telling and retelling were richer was really in the collaborative analysis that happened among the authors. Our process of thinking through the data from each site alongside one another and layering comparative analyses and observations throughout each chapter incrementally built a narrative about what was happening across those cities. The level of abstraction into theory, such as it is, could only be crafted through our writing across the different fieldwork stories, dipping into interview transcriptions from cities we had not visited, then comparing notes with the person who grew up there, or going back to reframe observations from our home site after being struck by what a team member had found in a different place. Now, given that this is an HDR workshop, I want to acknowledge that writing a PhD is not generally understood to be a collaborative piece of writing. We do usually expect that the thesis must be an individually authored text. But in writing collaboratively, I think we had to tear apart our previous writing practices a little bit and make explicit agreement or seek approval among ourselves or from the others about how we handled these writing decisions about narrative, our own narratives and those of our participants. The decisions and deliberations that we engaged in are not so different to the decisions that are made in individually authored texts, although when you're writing alone, you sometimes make those decisions unthinkingly or with minimal deliberation. But I think the question is still worth considering in our own individual writing. What are the tellings taking place here? What stories am I weaving through the stories others have told me, whether directly through an interview or in a narrative that has been abstracted and elevated to the status of theory? And I also think that when they're at their best, HDR communities are actually an incredible collaborative writing network and experience. That moment of writing alongside others can be extremely enriching, and that dialogic and incremental development of analysis, the shared practices of writing, can transform the thesis writing process. So I hope that some of these reflections about what we in our book traded off and what we ultimately gained in this recent example of collaboration and writing can spark some ideas of your own as well. Thank you very much.